views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
It's Independence Day weekend, and after the end of the Civil War in 1865, the nation's newly emancipated citizens transformed Independence Day into a celebration of Black freedom. The 4th became an almost exclusively African-American holiday in the states of the former Confederacy. And stay tuned on this edition of Perspective, because coming up front and center, we're going to talk about this and other significant contributions made to history by African Americans. You're watching Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let 'em know.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. And as always, you can watch Perspectives here live on BronxNet's Channel 67. If you have Verizon Files, that would be Channel 33, or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. We also encourage you. How do you stay connected to us? On all of our social media platforms at BronxNet TV. And then you're more than welcome to stay connected to me on Facebook, on my professional page, Daren C. Jaime, and then on Instagram and Twitter at DCJaime23. And there we can share, get some information as well as some inspiration. Well, if you've been tuning into Perspectives or you're just joining us for the very first time, I want to let you know that we have had some recent shows that have really centered on race relations here in America, how they've gone recently, particularly in the death and the aftermath of the George Floyd situation. Well, it's no secret that America, our nation, was actually built on the backs of Black Americans. In fact, slaves, even as slaves, African Americans helped to bring victory to the Union during the Civil War. And there's so many contributions that have existed throughout our nation's history by Blacks and African Americans today. We are dedicating our show today to really highlight a few of them. And so joining me now, and joining us, I should say, is someone that's very well versed on this topic, knows a lot about the contributions in history of African Americans. She's a writer on the history of African Americans and the author of Discovering Black America, which offers readers an unprecedented account into more than 400 years of African American history. I'm talking none other than to Miss Linda Tarrant-Reed, and she joins us now here on Perspectives. And Linda, good to have you.
Good to be here, Daren. I always love visiting Perspectives because we have such lively conversations.
Lively conversation, but most of all, also information. And that's exactly what we want to talk about. You know, we talk about the 4th of July, and we do talk about it as a holiday. It's a major holiday across America. And of course, things have shifted with COVID-19, but it doesn't change the fact that many people usually take that time as a holiday weekend. We've got barbecues, we got celebrations, and it's become an American holiday. But I'll just, throw it right into your hands immediately. It wasn't always an American holiday, but it certainly was a holiday that was celebrated by Blacks and African Americans.
Absolutely. In New York State in particular, when we began the gradual manumission of enslaved Africans, that was in 1799, the way the manumission was tiered was that on the 4th of July, depending on the enslaved person's age and gender, that is when they were free. They were emancipated. So the way that law, the New York State law, went, it did not emancipate all of the enslaved individuals in New York State. That did not happen until 1827. And of course, my take on that is that's another form of suppression. couldn't have all of the people free at the same time. But what that meant for so many African and African Americans is that July 4th was Emancipation Day, jubilation. And so there were celebrations. In New York, they would have parades, and actually the Amy Zion Church would be part of that celebration. And a lot of the ministers who were, known community leaders. And as you know, the Amy Zion Church was a church of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and were known as the Freedom Church. So we would be front and center with these celebrations, the jubilation, the celebration, July 4th.
And so we talk about July 4th, obviously connected to the church and people, but and African Americans, I should say, as a people. But one of the things that I want to talk about is, when did things start to change where it moved from being this African American holiday to now the holiday that we've come to know it?
Well, it started changing after the Civil War. So that was 1865. And when the South basically conceded, they were trying to create their own country, and that didn't work out for them. So they were brought back into the Union. And at that point, the free Black people were still celebrating July 4th. But then there became a lot of pushback and violence. And, after the Civil War, that's when the Ku Klux Klan started, evolving. And they were a group of Southern soldiers that vowed that the South would never die. And they took it upon themselves to become this terroristic group to keep, the Black population in the South terrorized. And so that was the beginning. So once that group rose up, the celebrations really did change, and people stopped celebrating so openly. African Americans, that is.
And when we talk about African Americans who've made significant contributions, I think that one of the things that we could talk about as we celebrate Independence Day is the fact that African Americans themselves and Blacks fought for a country, and I'm thinking particularly Tuskegee Airmen. You fought for a country. You fought to bring freedom, liberty, and democracy to a country that didn't necessarily give them that.
That's correct. And, history tells us that African Americans fought in every single U.S. war, starting from the American Revolution. So the American Revolution, the Civil War, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, we were there. But in the case of World War I and World War II, the Army was called, at that point, I think it was called the Army Air Force, and it was segregated. So the Tuskegee Airmen were African American men who were recruited to be flyers in the war. They were trained separately. They were discriminated. They were housed on various posts in separate, segregated, housing. They ate separately, but these young men were determined to learn how to fly those planes and go and fight the war for America. And of course, when they came back from war, they expected to be treated like war heroes, but they were not. And so that was a very difficult period, not only for African American soldiers, but, African American community, the society, people in America, because Jim Crow was very entrenched. Housing was segregated, education was segregated, and people of color were not earning. First of all, they couldn't get jobs. And the jobs that they got were on the lower rung, the service jobs, the housekeepers, the laundress, the chauffeurs. And so those jobs were destined to keep African Americans at the lowest end of the economic ladder. To this day, actually, economic inequality is rampant in America.
I want to do I want you to do me a favor and share with you a little bit, because in a few seconds I want you to talk a little bit about the Wall Street situation, Black Wall Street, because many people to this day still are not familiar with Black Wall Street. I want to do that after the break, but I do want to ask you very quickly before we go to break. As we're looking right now, and we're seeing what we see on the streets by way of allies and support and people coming out for social justice movements. Give me a little bit about just what we're seeing right now and how this is in line with history.
Well, I grew up during the civil rights movement, the 60s. And I have to say that I wasn't as active as these young people are today. I mean, it's really amazing to see all different young people from various backgrounds really taking up the charge of, I can't breathe, Black Lives Matter. It's wonderful to see, because for me, that generation of folks marching in the streets today, all they've known is a very diverse environment. My son is, 40 years old. I mean, and the people that he would bring home from school and college, I mean, it was like the League of Nations, which is a wonderful thing. And that's what I love about this group of young people and parents and grandparents from all races. And they're just really fed up with the way groups are treated, especially African American men. I mean, the fear that we as parents have when our African American sons, get in a car, go on a trip, go to the store, it's heart in your mouth until they walk back through the door. And no parent should feel that way about their child, or no wife should feel that way about their husband. So, the George Floyd murder, and that's exactly what it was, really struck a nerve with so many people. And I think, the reason why it has got so much momentum is that people were not distracted. We had been in our houses for 3 months, quarantining, being on lockdown, and to see that video of George Floyd struggling to breathe and that cop on his neck, people were outraged, as they should have been. Now, the difference between this current 21st century movement and protest, first of all, it's global, which is incredible. It's like the Arab Spring. They were the first kind of media protest that went around the world. This George Floyd Black Lives Matter protest has struck a nerve around the globe.
And Linda, let me just jump in here because I want to make sure I get to a break. I want you to pick up on it. I want you to finish that. Let me just get this break in right here. We're going to take a break with Linda Tarrant Reed here on Perspectives. We're going to come back and talk about how this George Floyd death has struck a nerve, yes, globally, locally, and nationally. We'll talk about that in a second. That plus the contributions of African Americans in present society when we return here on Perspectives. And welcome back here to Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you, our guest, Linda Tarrant Reed. And we were just talking before the break a little bit about the contributions of African Americans. And then we talked about civil rights and the difference between 2020 and what we might have seen in the civil rights movement before in the 60s. And so, Linda, I want you to pick up where you left off because we were talking a little bit about it's global. And when we talk about allies, we saw before in the 60s, a few people, and I don't want to diminish the number. There was a considerable amount of people from around the nation who
Right.
came together with civil rights with Dr. King. But what we're seeing right now, Black Lives Matter and all across the nation and the world, is allies who are Caucasian, white, and
Right.
other who are
Right.
really raising their voice in an unprecedented fashion.
And again, Daren, I think that it has struck a chord globally. You know, you have Germany, you have Italy, you have France, you have all these, you know, countries that have all of these young people. That's the other thing. There's a lot of young people in many of the countries. So they are speaking out because they witness the same type of thing in their cities and towns and villages, that, you know, people of color, they may not be African American, they may be, you know, Middle Eastern, they may be African from, you know, Morocco. They see the difference. They see how people are treated, how they get the lesser jobs, the lesser apartments. People, you know, treat them poorly on the street, or the police, you know, undue scrutiny. The thing that I was going to say is comparing the protests of 2020 with the protest of the civil rights movement. First of all, we did not have social media. The thing that really propelled the civil rights movement of the 1960s was television. And President John F. Kennedy was in the White House at the time, and Martin Luther King would, from time to time, you know, tell him, well, this is what we're getting ready to do. We're getting ready to march over here, or we're going to do this. And Kennedy and his brother were terrified of the visuals, very similar to the president we have today in the White House, who talks all about the visuals and what it looks like, and does he look good? You know, should I wear a mask? I don't want the, you know, the press laughing at me. But the Kennedys were very, you know, obsessed about the visuals of Black people being beaten by white police officers with batons, and dogs, you know, barking at the protesters. And the protesters were bussed in from colleges across the country. These were young white kids. And as you know, the Mississippi, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered. The three civil rights workers who came across the country, I think Cheney lived down there, and their job was to do voter registration. And they were followed by the Ku Klux Klan, who killed them and burnt their station wagon. Well, that was a game changer. That is when the civil rights movement really went national. And then for me, the importance of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was the legislation. Legislation was the backbone of the civil rights movement. The voter the voter rights, the voting rights, the Brown versus the Board of Education, you could not have separate but equal schools. You had to have integration. It was knocked down. I forgot the name of the actual Supreme Court decision, but it had been knocked down with Brown versus the Board of Education about separate, you know, YMCA, separate water fountains. So it wasn't just about separate schools. It was about separate facilities. So that meant that the law wanted Black Americans to be integrated into the greater society. And there was a law on the books. The cities, the states, the government could go after people who did not conform. So that was the difference. I mean, we're becoming, right now with this new protest movement, there are coming out of it some various commitments from corporations, which is important, from, you know, educators, colleges. Manhattanville recently, the last few days, they were called out by their Black students for not being diverse enough, not having Black representation on the trustee board. Many areas of our society are now being called out about their commitment to bringing Black and brown people into the boardrooms, the marketplace. So, it's too early to see what exactly is going to happen. But the other thing I like about this social media is that everybody has a camera. So anytime somebody calls somebody the N-word or says something that is just out of the question, they're videotaped. I mean, I saw one videotape where this young white woman cut off this Black man in a vehicle, and he followed her, got out of his car, started his camera, and said, "Why did you do that?" And he called her Karen, of course, which is the generic name for, white women who feel that they have white privilege and can say and do things that offend people of color. And so he videotaped. The woman was hysterical. She didn't want him to take her license plate. He said, "And don't you live in this building over?" And I mean, so what that did, it was very sad to see, but it's putting people on notice that their behavior, inappropriate behavior, can be documented and put on the internet, and you can lose your job.
Yeah, a lot has changed now. You can put if you put something out there, there's a different level of accountability with it, and that's something that's going to have to be dealt with when you think about making some ridiculous claims or to make these bogus calls. Because as we know, living in our community, one call to the police could end a person's life,
Right.
and that's not always the case, but it's happened all too frequently. And I think when people say enough is enough, I also think, Linda, there is a sentiment that we're living in right now that enough is beyond enough.
Yes, yes. I think people, of all ages are really fed up and, tired of waiting. And the other thing that has happened, because we've had, 3 to 4 months to sit and think, you can see who has stuff and who doesn't have stuff. And a lot of Black people certainly are not on par economically with their white counterparts. And, why is that? I'm smart. I went to college. I can speak well. So this is different. Now, the difference between the 60s, because I graduated from a historically Black college in 1971. I know I'm telling my age, but that's fine. And at that particular time, because of the civil rights movement, because of all the advances made through legislation, all of these white corporations came down to Hampton. At the time, it was called the Hampton Institute. It is now Hampton University, and recruited us directly from campus into these white corporations. So my first job after graduation, actually I got it before I graduated, was with Doubleday and Company, publishing company, on Park Avenue in New York City. And I knew nothing about publishing, but that was a world that was opened up to me by the civil rights movement. And, I was an English major, so it's perfect. And I was able to be in a training program and learn how the publishing corporation works. And I also met a lot of incredible authors. And that really inspired me to be a writer. And I could see how it was done, and it wasn't a mystery. It's a lot of work, but I could do it. And so that set me on my path to becoming a writer. And the history, that was a no-brainer. I love history.
Well, I want to go from history to destiny. I want to talk about where do we go from here. Got to take a quick break. Got more with Linda Tarrant-Reed. We'll be right back here on Perspectives. And we're back here. Our topic of conversation is talking about African Americans' contributions during the 4th of July weekend. And Linda, as we talk about the 4th of July, we talk about a time for America to celebrate freedom. It should be a time that we should be embracing our freedom, embracing our democracy, and in many ways, embracing our diversity, but still not so. We're still the divided states of America. I guess on this July 4th weekend, the question is, where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I have a lot of diverse friends, and everybody knows that I wrote this book, Discovering Black America. And when the protests started, they would call and go, "What's happening, Linda? Tell me what's going on." And I personally, I'm sick of being the interpreter. What I want people to do is to look into their hearts and their minds and to observe their behavior and to see that they indeed, practice white privilege, and that, there are certain things that they say and do that, just comes from an inner kind of thing. I mean, it's almost like you're born with it. So this is going to be a really difficult time because Black people do not have to be educated, because we know more about white people than white people know about themselves. My mother used to say that, and she was correct, because she was a domestic, so she worked in those homes. The point that I'm trying to make is that it is now time for white people to learn about the history of African Americans, that we're not just a one-dimensional people. We're not just the people that you see the police, arrest and wrestle to the ground or shoot as they're running away. That's not who we are. We are so many different, wonderful, beautiful people. We have families, we have gifts, we have history. And people need to take the time and read about it. So I'm giving my book to everybody. I'm suggesting.
I'm giving my book to everybody. Everybody's gonna get a copy. You get a book, I get a book, we all get a book. And it's important that we do. But listen, let's talk about the book. Before we go, how do people get an opportunity to put their hands on that book?
Well, the terrible thing right now is the book is out of stock. I talked to my publisher, and they said that they were thinking about reprinting it in paperback to make it more accessible, which I think is a wonderful idea. The book was published in 2012, and it's still around. You can get it on Amazon, but it's through different dealers. And, they jack up the price to like $15, not $15, like $50, $60. The book, I think when it was first published, it was $35. So you can get it on Kindle, and hopefully in the near future, you will be able to purchase a paperback. I'm also working on a book right now about pandemic gardening, because I'm the executive director of the Lincoln Park Conservancy, and one of our programs is Grow Lincoln Park Community Garden. And we feed a lot of people in not shelters, but food pantries and soup kitchens. And my push now is to teach people to grow their own vegetables in whatever patch of land or soil they have. It can be a container on a balcony. It could be, your front yard. It could be, a community space that you've commandeered. So the goal, because, this pandemic stuff is not going to go away. Food shortages are going to continue to happen. And you don't know the quality of your food or vegetables. You hear about the recall because of, salmonella. That's just the beginning of it. So growing your own vegetables and fruit will give you not only nutrition, but control over your health and your life.
Well, Linda, we're going to have to leave it there. And of course, we had a great time talking as always. We could go out for like 2 hours talking about all the great stuff that you've got as far as writing, as far as history. You're a great wealth of knowledge. It's always great to have you here on the show, and particularly at a time like this and the July 4th weekend. Thank you so much for coming and being with us.
It was my pleasure. And it's great to see you, Daren.
Good to see you, Linda Tarrant Reed, our guest here on Perspectives. We got to leave it there. So listen, everybody stay safe. Enjoy this holiday weekend. Stay social distant. You know, that's the thing we've got to do in order to continue to get better. And most of all, hey, share your perspective with somebody else you don't know. It just might make a difference in somebody else's life. Take care. See you soon.